Let's spend some time reviewing some life cycle scenarios. Whenever you are working, you are developing at the head end from the most current deployed process. It's not a good practice to work against this, so don't make separate dev, test, or production folders, only one folder with the latest version. But what about archiving old versions, you might ask? Well, your previously deployed versions are copies of your archived processes, so be sure to add useful notes each time that you deploy. Carefully manage objects if you need to fork or copy your process. Especially be careful not to duplicate connectors and then deploy them, because two connectors with the same name and pointing to the same place would be counted as two licenses, not one, since each is a unique connection component. Copy the deployed process back to a build folder if you want an archive or reference. And always remember that your deployed processes are your archives. We're back to our illustration to discuss promoting versus deploying. As we saw earlier, the process is deployed from the build tab to our development environment. When the process passes the initial testing and is ready to be promoted, it's best practice to copy that process to the next environment, which in this scenario is the test environment. The reason for this is that the developers may continue to make changes to the process in the build tab, and if you deploy directly to the test environment, you may not be deploying the same revisions of components that were tested in the dev environment. When the process passes the deep testing, it is once again best practice to copy the process to the production environment. This ensures that the copied versions are identical to what has been tested. So you should try to always deploy initially and then copy to promote to the next environment. Let's consider a few benefits and a few exceptions to this. So it's good practice, which ensures that the copied versions are identical to one another. This also minimizes risk in the development cycle because you're sure of what you're copying to the next environment. This requires a standard progression for everyone to follow, to deploy to dev, and then copy to test and production. This also supports consistent use of extensions. Everyone on the same page regarding use of connectors is a great way to collaborate. Now, this is not possible when there are profile differences requiring tuning and separate deployment. So what you could do there is extend the map and then re-import the profiles to manage any differences. However, it's not possible to extend EDI profiles. Also, this workflow is not possible when logic or scripts are different between the environments. So that was a best practice in the normal scenario of a development lifecycle where you would deploy and copy, but we all know that rarely is development lifecycle normal. So in this scenario, we must deploy directly to production to fix a critical production issue. We have a few different options. The first option is if the value is an extended property, then we can go into the environment and edit the extension to fix the issue. That would be, of course, a great scenario and a simple fix. Most likely that's not the case. So if the issue is not an extended property, then our second option is to go back to the build tab and update the process and redeploy. This will work if the versions are the same and the change is small. But what if the development team is already working phase 2 of the process and has changed everything? Then the third option would be to copy the deployed version in production back to the build tab, modify the component or components that need editing, and manage duplicate components. To determine if option 2 or 3 is best, it would be helpful if you could compare the processes to see the differences in versions from the deployed to the build tab. That would indeed be a great feature. And in fact, Boomi provides you with just such a feature. It's called Compare Process Deployments. Compare lets you identify differences in the component hierarchy between two versions of a process. Any deployed version, the latest live version, an older deployed version, or even a version on a different environment. This tool shows a list of components and which components have been changed. Keep in mind that not all shapes are components, so any changes to something like the notify or decision or branch shape are going to be reflected in the process component. Also, be sure to inspect actual differences within each component so you are aware of those exact changes. You can see in this example, the map is not a different version, it's an entirely different map, so you want to be careful about that. So Copy to Component Explorer is another great tool. It creates a snapshot of the deployed process back in the Builder tab, and it creates duplicate components of everything. When copying, you also have the option to copy certain components as needed, so you'd probably not want to create a duplicate of a connection. All the copied components are identical, but they have new component IDs and will be at version 1. This tool even allows a containing folder to be specified or created so that you're not mixing it in with your existing work. Now, why would you ever need to do this? There are several reasons. Perhaps you are forking where you want to start developing from a previously deployed version. Maybe you need to roll back. You have a problem in the build version and want to start developing from an older known version. Or perhaps simply for inspection. You want to view the details of a deployed process version. Another strategy for the hotfix situation would be to roll back to a previous revision of the process while the development team is working on the fix. Going back to a stable version of the process can be very helpful. You would go to the stable version in the Deploy tab and click on the gear and select Redeploy this version. This is common when you encounter problems with a hotfix. The restore makes a prior deployed version the new latest version and active version with a new version number. All components are identical to the prior version. Here's another scenario in terms of deployment strategies. As we covered earlier, deploying a master process automatically deploys dependent subprocesses. You do not need to deploy the subprocess separately. Separate subprocess deployment does not update the master process. So redeployment of the master is required to reestablish the relationship. Now, why would you deploy a subprocess separately? It's only if you want to run it separately. Maybe you want to schedule the subprocess to run on independently. So you should not have a pass-through start shape, or there will be no data when it runs separately. Depends on the start shape configuration as well. It must be connector or no data. And you can rerun documents through the subprocess separately if it is separately deployed. If the subprocess is a data pass-through, then it automatically gets deployed with the parent. Any changes to the subprocess means that you have to redeploy the parent. If the subprocess has any other start shape, then you can deploy it separately and therefore redeploy it separately as well. And the last wrinkle is the process route shape. The process route is essentially a process call and a route shape combined, but it has a special ability to have a subprocess be a data pass-through, but any changes to the subprocess can be redeployed independent from the parent. We want to review a few considerations for large organizations. If there are multiple divisions, this could be geographically or by business unit, you can consider setting up multiple accounts for different divisions, especially if there is little overlap of applications and connectors. So some of the benefits to this would be that services can be based on design patterns. So rather than sub-process calls dipping into someone else's territory, you can pursue a decoupled integration approach, such as publishing web services that allows other divisions to interact with you without exposing your processes or data to their development. Now, some of the drawbacks are that you lose shared components and possible risks since you have multiple development teams. There are some considerations while building for multiple developer environments. You might want to consider component locking feature, which locks a process into read-only mode for everyone else until the developer releases the lock. You should also set up folder permissions to further restrict access to sensitive work. And you can also restrict editing of shared components. Here are some considerations in deployment. Restrict deployment permissions by environment. Set up custom user roles so developers can only deploy to the dev environment and other users can promote to other environments. You can set up environment deployment roles to protect yourself from accidental promotion. You want promotions to be organized, so consider having an external check-in process for developers to promote to environments. You would want to keep careful watch over shared data by managing your extensions. And when deploying, include detailed notes and information on changes or what extensions need to be defined. Were new components added? Then document it. If existing components were modified, then detail what was changed. Process property values exist in memory during the process, but are not available after the execution ends. But by persisting a property, the value is stored in the atom after execution, thereby retaining its value. It's loaded into memory automatically the next time the process is executed on that particular runtime. If the process uses the flow control step with the parallel processing option on, if the persisted process property is being set in the flow controlled portion, then the property that is set last takes precedence. Don't extend your persisted properties. This can become difficult to manage and you can easily lose control. Some scenarios for using persisted process properties would be a migration scenario to keep track of the last ID migrated, or an incremental update to store the last modified date time. You would want to be aware of batching issues. You may get the first value in a batch, but not the last. And also think about the position in the process of where you're setting this value. Usually you would want to update the persisted property at the end to ensure rerun of records in a failure scenario. You can use the Atomsphere API for automated deployment scenarios. All Atomsphere accounts have the ability to do automated deployment. You can use a ticket manager or external governance application to call the API and deploy or promote through API without logging into the user interface. This may be appropriate for high volume situations like logistics or EDI where there are potentially hundreds of trading partners. Let's consider some best practices. Try to avoid having separate components in Boomi to maintain versions. That is, there should not be separate builder folders for test and production. Consider your work as one line of code. Deployed versions are your archive. Deploy the process to make a snapshot of your process. That way you can always roll back that deployed version into your build tab. Deploy first to a development environment and then promote up using copy. Generally, only deploy master processes. Unless you're aware of the implications we previously covered, you want to deploy the master and remember that the sub-process is also being deployed. For most scenarios, set up separate environments for each Boomi runtime. Use extensions to manage endpoints and risk across environments. Extend parameters which could change. This would be something like passwords, query parameters, or static values. Only define extensions in the master process to be deployed, unless also deploying sub-processes to run as standalone. Audit extended fields for any new processes. Extend common set of fields of a component when using across multiple processes. Consider using a common folder to manage shared extendable components. In shared development environments, use notes at deployment to identify extended fields.